The morning my father-in-law was buried, my brother-in-law handed me an envelope and told me to read it before the reception ended. I was still wearing black. My heels were sinking into the soft cemetery grass. My daughter, Lily, was 3 years old and had fallen asleep against my shoulder, her small fist clutching the collar of my blazer. And my brother-in-law, Derek, stood there in his custom suit with that practiced smile he always wore when he was about to do something he knew was wrong. "Dad wanted you to have this," he said, "before things get complicated." I should have known right then. Complicated was Derek's favorite word for situations he had already engineered. My name is Claire Hendricks. I was 31 years old when my father-in-law, Robert Calloway, died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in October. I had been married to his son, Marcus, for 6 years. I was a forensic accountant at a mid-sized firm in Charlotte, which meant I spent my working hours finding the numbers people tried to hide. I was very good at my job. My brother-in-law was about to find that out. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Robert Calloway had built Calloway Logistics from nothing. He started with 2 trucks and a warehouse lease in 1987 and spent 30 years turning it into a regional freight company worth somewhere north of $40 million. He was a quiet man, careful with words, generous in ways he never announced. When Marcus and I got married, Robert pulled me aside at the reception and told me the Calloway name came with expectations I hadn't signed up for. He said it like a warning, not a welcome. I appreciated his honesty more than he ever knew. Marcus was the younger son. Derek was 5 years older, already embedded in the company, already positioning himself as the natural heir. The 2 brothers had never been close, but they had managed a functional distance for most of their adult lives. That distance collapsed the moment Robert's health started declining. Marcus and I had moved to Charlotte for my career. Derek had stayed in Raleigh, close to the company, close to Robert, building influence the way some men build walls quietly, consistently, brick by brick. By the time Robert had his first minor cardiac episode 18 months before he died, Derek had already inserted himself into every business decision, every financial review, every conversation about succession. I noticed. Marcus told me I was reading too much into it. I loved my husband. I want to be clear about that. Marcus was kind in the particular way that people who grew up around money sometimes are. He assumed the best of everyone because he had never needed to assume otherwise. It was a blindness born from comfort, and I spent 6 years loving him through it. His brother did not share that blindness. Derek saw everything, calculated everything, and waited. Robert died on a Tuesday. The will reading was scheduled for the following Monday. In the 5 days between those 2 events, I watched Derek move through the family with a precision that should have made everyone uncomfortable. He handled the funeral arrangements. He spoke with Robert's attorney twice that I knew of. He was warm and organized and ever-present, and every time I walked into a room where he was speaking quietly with someone, the conversation stopped. At the cemetery, he handed me that envelope. I opened it that night after Lily was asleep and Marcus had taken a sedative and gone to bed early. I sat at the kitchen table in Robert's house. We were all staying there for the week, and I read what was inside. It was a letter, handwritten, on Calloway Logistics stationery. It said that Robert had decided, after careful consideration, to leave the entirety of his estate, the company, the properties, the liquid assets to Derek, as the son who had dedicated his life to the business. It said Marcus would receive a one-time payment of $250,000. It said nothing about me. It said nothing about Lily. At the bottom, in the same handwriting, it said, "Claire, I think it's best if you and Marcus accept this arrangement quietly. Derek has offered to provide you with an additional settlement of $15 million in exchange for your signature on a release of any claims against the estate. This is more than fair. Please be reasonable." I read it twice. Then I set it on the table and looked at it for a long time. There were 3 things wrong with that letter, and I identified all 3 within the first minute. The first was the handwriting. I had seen Robert's signature on documents before he had co-signed a lease agreement Marcus and I had needed 3 years ago, and I had handled the paperwork. Robert wrote his capital R with a distinctive backward slant, a habit so ingrained it appeared on every document I had ever seen him sign. The capital R in this letter was upright, clean, practiced, but wrong. The second was the stationery. Calloway Logistics had rebranded in the spring. New logo, new letterhead. The stationery in my hands had the old logo. The third was the phrase "more than fair." I had heard Derek use those exact words in an argument with Marcus 2 Christmases ago. Robert Calloway, in all the years I had known him, expressed generosity without ever justifying it. He would never have written that it was more than fair. That was Derek's language, not his father's. Someone had forged this letter, and they had handed it to me at a cemetery while I was holding my sleeping daughter, calculating that grief would do what intimidation couldn't. I put the letter back in the envelope. I went to bed. I did not say a word to Marcus. The will reading was Monday. I had 4 days. I want to explain something about forensic accounting that most people don't understand. The work is not dramatic. It is not fast. It is the painstaking process of following numbers through time tracing where money came from, where it went, what it was called along the way, and whether the story the numbers tell matches the story the people tell. I had spent 9 years learning to read financial documents the way other people read faces. Calloway Logistics had 30 years of financial history, and Derek had been embedded in it for the last 8. I started with what I had access to legally and immediately: the company's public filings, the property records for Robert's estate, the documents Marcus had received over the years as a shareholder. Marcus owned 12% of Calloway Logistics. He had never paid much attention to what that meant. I had. What I found in those first 2 days was not the forgery. That was almost secondary. What I found was something Derek had been doing for at least 4 years, buried in vendor payments and subsidiary transfers, structured carefully enough to survive a casual review but not careful enough to survive mine. He had been moving money out of Calloway Logistics into a shell company he controlled. Not enormous amounts at once that would have triggered flags. Small amounts, frequently, through legitimate-looking vendor relationships that existed on paper and nowhere else. Over 4 years, I estimated he had extracted somewhere between $3 and $4 million from a company he did not yet own, from a father who trusted him completely. I printed nothing. I saved everything to an encrypted drive I kept in my coat pocket. On Sunday night, I asked Marcus to take Lily to the park. When they were gone, I sat down with Robert's personal attorney, a man named Gerald Whitmore, who had been Robert's lawyer for 20 years, and whose number I had found in Robert's address book, and I told him I needed 45 minutes of his time before the will reading. Gerald Whitmore was 70 years old and had the specific stillness of a man who had heard everything and been surprised by very little. He listened to me for 30 minutes without interrupting. I showed him the letter Derek had given me. I showed him the stationery discrepancy, the signature variance, the phrase that wasn't Robert's. Then I showed him the financial transfers. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "Robert came to see me 8 months ago. He told me he was concerned about some irregularities he had noticed. He asked me to keep a sealed letter in my possession and to read it aloud at the will reading, regardless of any other documents that might be presented." I looked at him. "I think," Gerald said carefully, "that Robert knew something was coming." I did not sleep that night. The will reading was at 10 in the morning in Gerald's conference room. Derek arrived first, already settled into his chair, like a man who had already decided how the meeting would go. His wife, Sandra, sat beside him, thin-lipped and careful. Marcus sat across from them, still raw with grief in the way younger siblings often are, still believing the world would arrange itself fairly. I sat beside my husband and said nothing. Gerald opened the proceedings. He read the formal language of the will, the document Robert had executed 14 months ago, updated from a prior version. In that document, Robert had left Calloway Logistics to be divided equally between his 2 sons, with Marcus and Derek each receiving 44% and the remaining 12% Marcus's existing shares staying with Marcus, bringing his total to 24%. The properties and liquid assets were split proportionally. Derek's expression did not change. He had prepared for this. From his briefcase, he produced a document and slid it across the table to Gerald. "There's a codicil," Derek said. Dad signed it 6 weeks before he died. It supersedes the earlier distribution. Gerald examined it without touching it, using a pen to turn the pages. Before we address this document, Gerald said, I am required to read a letter Robert Calloway asked me to hold in trust. Derek's expression shifted. Just slightly, just enough. Gerald opened his desk drawer and produced a sealed envelope cream-colored, with Robert's unmistakable handwriting on the front. He broke the seal and read aloud. Robert had written it in plain language, the way he did everything. He said he had become aware, over the preceding year, of financial irregularities in the company that bore his name. He said he had not yet been able to confirm their source, but that he was placing his suspicions on record with his attorney in the event that anything happened to him before he could investigate fully. He said he was not changing his will because he still hoped he was wrong about what he suspected. He said that if a codicil appeared after his death purporting to change the distribution of his estate, his attorney was instructed to treat it with extreme scrutiny and to engage in independent forensic review before it could be executed. He said, I built this company for both my sons. I did not build it to be stolen. The room was very quiet. Derek said, that letter doesn't change the legal validity of the codicil. Gerald said, you're correct that it doesn't automatically invalidate it. However, it does trigger the independent review clause, which means the codicil cannot be executed until that review is complete. He paused, and I've been contacted this morning by a forensic accountant who has asked to present findings relevant to the estate. Derek looked at me. I looked back at him. That would be me, I said. I will not pretend the next 3 weeks were easy. Derek hired attorneys. His attorneys argued the financial transfers were legitimate consulting fees. My documentation argued otherwise, and my documentation was better than his attorneys. The forensic review Gerald commissioned confirmed my findings within 10 days and identified an additional $800,000 I had not yet traced. The codicil which Derek had indeed forged, using a notary who turned out to be the husband of his personal assistant, was voided. The original will stood. Marcus received his rightful share of the estate and the company. Derek was removed from Calloway Logistics by its board of directors pending a full investigation. The district attorney's office opened a criminal inquiry 3 weeks after the will reading. I was contacted twice by investigators and provided everything I had. I was not called as a witness because by the time the case moved forward, the evidence I had handed them was sufficient without my testimony. The letter Derek had given me at the cemetery, the forged one, with the $15 million offer I had photographed before the will reading and provided to Gerald and to the investigators. Derek's attorney argued his client had simply been passing along a document he'd found among Robert's papers. No one believed that. Sandra filed for divorce 4 months later. I want to tell you about the moment I decided not to accept that envelope quietly. It was not the forgery that made me angry. It was not the money, not even the injustice of it. It was the timing. It was the fact that Derek had calculated, had genuinely decided that handing me that letter at my father-in-law's burial, while I was holding my daughter, while my husband was 20 feet away crying at a gravestone, was the optimal moment to try to buy my silence. He had looked at my grief and seen a transaction. I had looked at his letter and seen a mistake. There is something I think about sometimes, when I consider how close it came to going differently. If Derek had been slightly more careful with the stationery, if he had studied Robert's handwriting more closely, if he had chosen different words, the scheme might have worked at least long enough to make fighting it enormously complicated and expensive. But Derek had spent years in a room with his father, watching a man run a company honestly, and he had learned all the wrong lessons. He had learned the operational details and none of the ethics. He had learned how to speak in Robert's cadences without absorbing what Robert actually believed. Robert believed people earned what they had. Robert believed that if you were willing to look carefully at something, the truth was usually there. Robert had, in the end, trusted that someone would look carefully. He just hadn't known it would be his daughter-in-law. Marcus struggled, for a while, with what his brother had done. That's the part no one outside the situation really understands. The grief doesn't end when the villain is exposed. Sometimes it gets heavier, because now you're grieving the version of your family you thought you had. Marcus had to mourn his father and his brother at the same time, and those were two different kinds of loss with two different shapes. We went to therapy, both of us, together and separately. It helped. Lily turned 4 that December, in a house that was quieter than it had been, and she wore a paper crown she'd made at preschool and declared that her birthday cake needed more sprinkles, and I stood in the kitchen watching her, and thought about Robert's letter sitting in Gerald's desk, waiting to be read. He had known something was coming. He had planned for the possibility that the people he loved might fail him. And in the middle of that preparation, he had still hoped he was wrong. I think about that a lot. The combination of clear-eyed realism and stubborn love. The willingness to look at a hard truth without letting it make you bitter. That's the thing about forensic work, really. The numbers don't lie, but they also don't hate anyone. They just record what happened. What you do with that information, whether you use it to protect people or to punish them, whether you carry it quietly or weaponize it, that's still a human choice. Derek made his choices. I made mine. Calloway Logistics is still operating. Marcus is now on the board. He's not a logistics person by training, but he's been learning, and the people who built their careers there are glad the company didn't end up with someone who saw it as a personal fund. Gerald Whitmore retired at the end of that year. He sent us a card at Christmas. He wrote, in very small handwriting, that Robert would have been proud. I read it at the kitchen table, with Lily eating cereal across from me, asking why I was smiling at a piece of paper. I told her sometimes people write things down so the truth can wait for the right moment to be heard. She considered this very seriously. The way 4-year-olds consider things they don't quite understand but sense are important. Then she asked for more cereal. I gave her more cereal. And if Derek is reading this, and I suspect he might be, given everything, I want him to know that I don't carry anger about what he did. That's not me being gracious. That's me being honest. The anger would cost me something. His consequences cost him everything. That math was always going to work out the way it did. I'm a forensic accountant. I know how numbers end. People ask me sometimes if I feel sorry for Derek. It's a fair question, and I've sat with it long enough to answer honestly. I feel sorry for who he could have been. Derek grew up in the same house as Marcus. He watched the same father build something real from nothing. He had every opportunity to inherit not just the company, but the character behind it. And somewhere along the way, he decided the company was worth more than the character. That's not a tragedy that happened to him. That's a choice he made, slowly, over years, one small compromise at a time. That's the thing about the path Derek took. It didn't start with forgery. It started with the first vendor payment he redirected and told himself it was compensation he deserved. It started with the first conversation he shut down when Robert walked in. Every large betrayal I have ever uncovered in my professional life began with a small one that went unchallenged. People don't wake up one morning and decide to become someone who forges their father's signature at his own funeral. They arrive there gradually, through a long series of decisions they rationalized as reasonable at the time. I think about Claire, about myself, standing at that cemetery with Lily asleep on my shoulder, reading a letter designed to use my grief as leverage. Derek had calculated that I would be too exhausted, too sad, too overwhelmed to look closely. He had built his entire plan around the assumption that I would take the path of least resistance. What he didn't understand was that I had spent 9 years training myself to look closely at exactly the things people hoped I wouldn't examine. He handed his greatest mistake directly to the one person in that family whose entire career was built on finding hidden things. There's a lesson in that, and it has nothing to do with luck. It has to do with what you build inside yourself during the ordinary years, before the crisis arrives. I didn't develop the skills to read those financial documents during the 4 days between the funeral and the will reading. I developed them over 9 years of quiet, unglamorous work. The ability to protect my family in that moment existed because of 10,000 hours of preparation that had nothing to do with that moment. That is how integrity actually works, not as a dramatic stand you take when the stakes are highest, but as a practice you maintain when no one is watching and nothing seems to depend on it. Marcus had to grieve his brother and his father at the same time, And I watched him do it with more grace than most people could manage. He didn't become bitter. He didn't let Derek's choices rewrite his memory of Robert. He held both truths at once, that his family had failed him, and that his family had also given him something worth protecting. That kind of emotional honesty is its own form of strength, and I have more respect for it than I have for anything I did with a spreadsheet. What Robert left behind in that sealed letter was not just a legal instruction, it was an act of faith. Faith that someone would look carefully enough, care enough, and be prepared enough to do something with what they found. He couldn't have known it would be me, but he built a life that attracted people who paid attention, and in the end, that mattered. The numbers always tell the truth eventually. So do people, if you give them enough time.